Yeah, so for the last 5 years or so, I've been having continual visions of the Tower of Babel,
Hmm.
like constantly, once a month, sometimes for a whole month. I just can't get it out of my head. It's in my
Hmm.
dreams, it's in my nightmares. I think about the story all the time.
Hmm.
So it's the one story from the Bible that just has like latched onto me and I can't get rid of it. And I think it's a sign that there's something going on in our culture right now that reflects that story, and that's why I'm seeing it so much. Or it reflects
Hmm.
something about me.
Hmm.
And what I find amazing is that it's a tiny little story. Like it's 3 paragraphs, but it has that polysemous quality where you can keep finding deeper and deeper meaning by reading it. So I've just been reading it over and over again and reading different commentaries on it,
Hmm.
particularly Jordan Peterson's commentary on it, which really helped me a lot. But I think I've found like a specific, like unique thread that I really haven't heard any other commentators talk about, which is the a technological aspect of the story.
Hmm.
So I just wanted to talk about the story with you today and get your thoughts on it, share what I'm seeing, and see if we can get to the bottom of anything because this
Hmm.
story bothers me in a way. It's always on my mind, and it's something that I need to figure out.
Right. And it bothers you, I assume, because you can intuit that there's a deeper meaning there that's applicable to your life and decisions that you make as you move through your life, but you don't quite know what it is.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I'm familiar with the story at this point. I'm familiar with Jordan Peterson's interpretation at this point. I'm familiar with the Josephus version, but let's just jump right into the technological side, and then maybe I can give
Yeah,
you some
so
comments
well,
on.
just to like provide the high level beats of the story, I know you
Yeah,
already know it, but Noah's
right.
descendants, they travel east to the land of Shinar, and
Mm-hmm.
they decide to build a city there. But they also decide to build a tower that reaches all the way to heaven. And they do it so that they can make a name for themselves, lest they be scattered across the earth.
Mm-hmm.
But then God comes down, sees what they're doing, and he says, if they can do this, then they can do anything.
Mm-hmm.
So what he does is he comes down and confounds the language of the people, which kind of um, like yeah, confounding the language of the people kind of like broke the project, and the project fell apart, and the people were scattered across the earth. Because I originally thought that the story was God like sent some lightning down or a storm to destroy the
Mm-hmm.
tower.
Yeah,
And I've
that's what
heard
I
that
thought
in
too.
some versions and some
Yeah.
commentary, but in the
Mm-hmm.
Bible it doesn't actually mention that. It just says he comes down and confounds their language, and then
Mm-hmm.
that kind of disperses the project. And when I first read the story, I found it kind of weird because I'm like, that's pretty bad of God to do that. They're just trying to build a tower. It's rational that they would want to build a tower to heaven after a flood, and he comes down and destroys it. So
There,
I always
there's
found it kind of
there.
weird.
I do want to say one thing too. It's not obvious in the story that this is forbidden behavior in the first place.
No, it's not.
So I
Yeah.
mean, it's interesting because it's not like there's a covenant or a law, and then man breaks the law. And so it's like man's just doing what God made man to do. And
Hmm.
then through that process, there's, well, and I'm curious, is it a punishment or is it just a result of, because if you build a skyscraper, but maybe and this is what happens in China all the time, they use bad construction methods and then it falls apart. Is that a punishment? Not necessarily, but it is a consequence.
Yeah,
And
I think
so
it's a
that
it's a
that
it's a
part is
consequence of the
interesting.
flood. So you've got to think that
Hmm.
this story came immediately after the flood. So the
Yeah.
first descendants of Noah. Um, so they just had a world-destroying, catastrophic flood that killed all of their ancestors except for a handful. So they would naturally be in fear of that and constantly thinking, how are we going to avoid the next flood if it comes?
Yeah, get higher
And
and higher,
it makes
seems
so
like.
it's a
Yeah.
rational idea to try and build a tower all the way to heaven that transcends God. But the moral
Hmm.
of the story, I think the core moral of the story is that there's a risk that as soon as you think that you can build a structure or a system that reaches all the way to heaven, you dethrone God or supplant God or dispense with the transcendent. and then you immediately occupy the category of hell. Just like
Hmm.
Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost, as soon as he rebelled against
Hmm.
God, he descended into hell. So that's what I think that the core moral of the story is that as soon as you think that you can build something that reaches heaven, you end up worshiping it as if it's God, and you end
Hmm.
up creating a totalitarian system around it with
Hmm.
one language. And I think
Hmm.
that's really interesting because it was in a time of humanity where everyone did speak the same language. Um, but God earlier in Genesis to Noah told him to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth.
Hmm.
So I think the great sin of the builders of the Tower of Babel is that they didn't follow that guidance. So instead of them traveling around and exploring the unknown and expanding their civilization, they basically said, no, let's stay in one place, lest we be scattered across the earth and build a huge tower. So I think that that decision it's tantamount to rejection of the unknown. It's just saying like forget the unknown
Hmm.
out there and forget God's command to go and like people and replenish the earth. We're just going to stay here and stay in the known. But I think the moral is that whenever you do that, it ends up becoming a totalitarian structure that tries to encompass everything. And naturally, if you think that you can build something to heaven, then you think that you've got a system and a language that can encompass everything. But because
Well,
we're limited beings, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
there's a there's an issue with that, right? So exploring the unknown happens in every dimension, right? It doesn't just happen like linearly where it spreads out, say horizontally across like the face of the earth. But it
Mm.
also happens by going inward, it happens by going outward, and it happens by going up. So the exploration
Mm.
could be considered equally valid if it goes upward, going into the realms of heaven as
Yeah,
well.
yep. Yeah, because that's going out into the unknown as well.
Right.
Like, hey, we've never built a
Hmm.
tower that high. That's the unknown. But I think it's the not the unknown that God was commanding them to go out
But
to.
who is this God anyways? Because the God of the Old Testament is not the God of Jesus. It's not the God of it. It almost makes me think of like a Gnostic version where it's like the demiurge, some sort of
Mm.
like lower entity that has enough power to be able to lord over humans of this time, but it's not ultimately the good, the true, and the beautiful,
Yeah, yeah, and
or
that's
like the
why.
higher, it doesn't seem to be a God of love. If love is the highest form of consciousness and say, what you brought up in the past, like analogous to gravity, the one cosmic force that brings everything together. Like, I wonder if this is like a lower God that's making it's like a tyrannical,
Mm.
lower. I mean, I don't know because it just seems like there's contradictions here, and it reminds me of some of the complexities of like the story of Job,
Mm.
right? Where it has something to do with the fact that God is incomplete until man, his creation, has an encounter, a confrontation with that entity,
Yeah,
and then that entity grows into something more full. But ultimately, that does seem like it's merely a projection of the human that's trying to put God into a framework that's knowable, and maybe that's an impossible ordeal. But the conception of God at this time in this story seems to be very limited. It doesn't see, or I mean, maybe not very limited, but has limiting aspects to it.
yeah, because I think that
So
the
I'm
God of
questioning
love in
that.
the New Testament, it's like he could only come about after all of the wrestling with God that individuals did in the
Hmm.
Old Testament. So it's almost like
Hmm.
God is transforming as well. And I know that there's like an idea that God is immutable and static and doesn't
Hmm.
change, but if you look at the Bible, it looks like he does. And
Yeah, definitely.
if you look at the Old Testament, it's basically all about the attempt to establish the perfect state.
Mm.
But it ultimately fails, just like Moses never
Hmm.
reached the promised land. And you see that story in the Tower of Babel, because the Tower of Babel is the attempt to establish the first state. So Nimrod, who led the construction of the Tower of Babel, was essentially the first king in the Bible. and he wanted to create this system that encompassed everything. Um, so, and then you see that throughout the whole Old Testament, where the people keep trying to create the perfect state of Israel, and then it becomes corrupted, and then it collapses, and then it does that again over and over again.
Hmm.
But the difference with that and the New Testament is that the New Testament isn't trying to create the perfect state. It's saying that the perfect state is insufficient. What you need is the perfect individual. So there's a shift to like individual sovereignty above the state in the New Testament. And there's also a
Hmm.
shift in the way that it pitches rules, because the Old Testament is thou shalt not, but
Hmm.
Christ in the New Testament is thou shalt. So it's much more of a positive,
Mm.
active good rather than just following a set of rules to avoid the bad.
Yeah, and it
Um,
reminds me too of when Peterson talks about exposure therapy, like say if you have like some sort of complex, he's saying the way to be able to address that is you gradually expose yourself by way of proximity to that issue that you have, maybe
yeah,
first just even recognizing it, then thinking about it, then putting the first steps of action to get into it. And then over time, you advance on it because it's your will that is voluntarily confronting the issue rather than the issue saying, you will not, because thou shalt not is like a pushing away, and the thou shalt is like an advancing towards. So I think from a psychological standpoint, maybe that's also part of the evolution of how human beings gain greater competence in relating to reality in
yeah,
whatever form it is. Like, does that resonate with the way you're
yeah,
thinking?
yeah. And I wonder if, because I'm thinking of the god of the Tower of Babel, because I think
Mm-hmm.
the builders must have had some revelation of that tower.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe God gave them that revelation, but then he realized later, oh no, that's not going to work. But and that's where I think that I keep finding this thread in the story about technological revolution that I never really hear anyone talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So the story specifically says, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used bricks instead of stone and tar for mortar. And I always wondered about that. Like, why would they include that? It seems arbitrary what they'd be using to build the tower. But that's actually a huge historical technological revolution when we shifted from like building with stone to building with baked bricks and building with tar instead of mortar. And if you think about it, like, it must have been so hard back in the day to quarry stone and carve it out into individual bricks. They wouldn't have been the same size. It would have been a huge endeavor to build even a small tower. But I learned that when these people moved east to Mesopotamia and Shinar, there wasn't any stone quarries out there, and there wasn't as many limestone quarries to make mortar. So they had to use the materials that they had out there, and they had clay. So I guess they started experimenting with it and realized that if they baked the clay like they used to bake mud bricks, but under a kiln, that it would make the bricks rock hard. And then that they could make them in a uniform manner because they could basically create a mold, like an assembly
Mm-hmm.
line, and just keep pouring it in. So I think I keep imagining that moment when they first realized that worked, because they basically would have realized that we can make bricks way faster and way cheaper. And what that allowed them to do is abstract from that, and it allowed
Mm-hmm.
them to abstract the idea of bigger towers. But the problem was that capacity for abstraction that the bricks allowed also like catalyzed an inflation where we abstracted the idea all the way up to heaven and tried to encompass everything. So I think that's the core technological message that's embedded in here is that the psychological inflation in the story is actually a catalyst of a technological transformation. So every time a new technology comes along, it increases our capacity to abstract, but that introduces the risk that we abstract that idea all the way up to heaven and like attempt to encompass everything and dethrone God.
So what would be the proper stance to take if you're trying to build a structure to avoid the tragedy of the flood again, and you do have a connection to the divine, um,
Hmm.
What is the proper orientation that that a
Yeah.
builder, an architect should have?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I've got two answers to that, and it's what comes before and after the Babel story. So the first is Noah, because
Hmm.
Noah had a revelation of a technological invention as well, to avoid a flood, but he didn't try to build it all the way to heaven. He just wanted to
Hmm.
build something to get through that flood. So I think that's one
Hmm.
answer. It's like, how do you avoid building a Tower of Babel? It's like, don't try and create a solution to all floods ever. Just try and create a solution to this specific flood.
Okay.
Um, but the other answer, I think, is what comes after the Tower of Babel story, which is the story of Abraham. So the story of Abraham, it comes immediately after Babel. And it's essentially the first story of an individual in the Bible, where they really lay out a full plot for his life. Instead of it just being like a highly short plot,
Hmm.
it's like a complex individual plot like you would see in a novel. And Abraham starts off like staying in his father's tent. He's 80 years old.
Hmm.
He's not going out into the unknown. The exact same sin that the builders of the Tower of Babel made by rejecting the unknown. But then God commands him to go out and confront the unknown. And he constantly does that throughout his story. So I think that's the other solution to the Babel problem is like individual sovereignty and as an individual you going out into the unknown. But the other one is Noah, which is don't try and build a tower that tries to solve the issue of all floods. Try and build a solution to just this one specific flood.
Yeah. But isn't building the highest tower that's ever been built and trying to connect with heaven like the greatest unknown? Like, what is.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it would be the greatest unknown, but there's an enormous risk in it because we're
Hmm.
limited beings in an infinite world. And as soon as you think that you can physically build something that can reach heaven, then you're becoming inflated and you're rejecting the idea of the transcendent if you think that you can bring
Yeah.
that about. But this
Well,
introduces like a tricky
yeah.
idea because I actually kind of disagree with what I just said in a way
Oh, okay.
because it brings about the question of like whether you can bring about heaven on earth
Hmm.
or whether it's just something in the afterlife. Because after studying Peterson, it seems like the his whole theory is about bringing heaven on earth during your lifetime here
Hmm.
and avoiding hell on earth.
Hmm.
So I think that there's like the attempt to create some sort of bridge between heaven and earth in our lifetime is it a divine goal, I would say. But
Well, then
it's risky.
now I'm thinking, okay, in the New Testament, Christ says, the kingdom of heaven is spread on the earth, something like that. But people don't have the eyes to see.
Hmm.
And so now I'm thinking, like, what if the great sin of the Tower of Babel, sin being missing the mark, was trying to get somewhere else? Like
Hmm.
thinking that, the tower is going to go to heaven and then heaven's up there. And so really the orientation is just pointed in the wrong direction. It's
Yeah,
like it's
exactly.
not, because then the idea is that it's actually all over the earth.
And
It's
within.
not somewhere else. And then also the other thing is, like, if you're just to take it from a literal standpoint, like the garden is here, and what is up there? Like if you think about it literally, beyond the
Hmm.
atmosphere and all that. I mean, space is death. Like going into like that seems like hell to me. Like being up in the vacuum and darkness of space. I mean, there's nothingness out there, right? Where what is divine is the somethingness. It's like
Hmm.
life itself. Life itself is divine. There's no life up there. So I wonder if it just I'd never thought about that before, but to your point, like recognizing that heaven isn't somewhere else, it's present, and so recognizing the presence. But then also the other commandment is that you should go out. You should go over there, but not over there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like how does present? I don't know. There's some. It seems like there might be something there.
Yeah, because I think like the goal to try and create heaven on earth seems to be a good
Hmm.
goal, but
Yeah.
how do you know where that is? Like the builders of the tower assumed, well, heaven's just up there. If we just build it
Yeah.
straight up, we're going to find it. But like you said,
Yeah.
it's everywhere. It transcends time. It's within and without.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the ultimate risk. But it seems like we have to attempt that. And that's why I don't see the Tower of Babel story as solely a negative story.
Yeah.
Because I think that it was like, I think that that it actually was like a catalyzation of an increase in consciousness. So this
Mm-hmm.
technological transformation of like bricks and tar allowed us to abstract so much that it increased our intellectual capacity. But
Mm-hmm.
that also came with an inflation where it tried to encompass everything. And it seems like we do
Mm-hmm.
that with every technological revolution, and we're going to do it with AI, where it
Mm-hmm.
becomes this monolith that's trying to speak one language, and then it becomes a totalitarian system that ends up falling apart across time. Like I'm even seeing it with
But
ChatGPT.
isn't the logos one language? The
Well,
logos itself, like the way that the divine speaks to man.
yeah, so the logos is the like capacity for truthful speech and to name
Mm-hmm.
things, or the capacity to bring order out of chaos. And that's an interesting part of this story that I love, is that I really think that the Babel story is a story about the logos, even though it's not
Mm-hmm.
mentioned.
Yeah.
Because in trying to build the tower, they tried to put everyone under one language, and it was an extremely complex system. But I think that the moral of the story is that if you try and create a complex system that tries to encompass everything under one language, naturally you're going to fail because the world's too complex and you're not going to be able to boil it down to one language. So what happens is, so you start off with this homogeneous language, but what happens is heterogeneous languages just emerge because the people at the top of the hierarchy and the people at the bottom of the hierarchy start speaking a different language. And the example Jordan Peterson uses is the European Union. So you had all of these different countries and states kind of joined together
Mm.
in one hierarchy, but it's
Yeah.
got 300 million people in it. And the bureaucracy at the top, which is trying to become globalist and
Mm-hmm.
control things under one language, is becoming too tight so that the people at the bottom, they're not even speaking the same language anymore. And I think the whole drive over the last like 5-10 years towards globalism, like everything that the World Economic Forum is pushing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a Tower of Babel, and you see how much
Mm-hmm.
confusion it's created in the language in our culture. Like we don't even know what a woman is anymore. Like there's all these fundamental
Yeah,
questions about
but that's a
language.
new that's a new language. Like that whole progressive speak, and like woke language, like that's a new language. That
Well, I
never
think it's a
existed
Babel
before.
language. I think it happens
Mm.
whenever a totalitarian regime emerges that's trying to create a system that encompasses everything.
Mm-hmm.
That style of language will emerge.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I'm
So,
interested to hear thoughts on like that technological side of it because I think it can't be an accident that they said like let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly, use bricks instead of stone and tar for mortar. Like why would they include that unless that technological transformation was somehow a catalyst for what comes after it?
well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, and I don't know that I have a good answer for this, but when you look at the like the primary function of how life exists through time, there's an evolutionary component where the animal finds environmental fit. It has to find fitness, right? So that fitness is becoming adapted to the environment, predators, prey. Um, it itself has to change. And so with man, the change is through tools. And what it makes me think of initially is that the evolutionary impulse to develop these particular tools was insufficient for the environment that it was trying to adapt to. And because
Mm,
of that, it collapsed. And so maybe the lesson there is that the technology wasn't correct for the job. It's like maybe,
mm,
trying to use a screwdriver to drive a nail or something like that. Because the tar part never made sense to me. And also, when you look at the way that, say, Adobe or bricks are laid in, erecting buildings, it's still mortar. It's like I don't understand what
yeah.
the tar is. So then
Yes.
that makes me
That was
think that
that
there's
was
that.
interesting because they didn't have the lime that they would use to make mortar in Shinar. So
Okay.
but they had bitumen, so they could make tar out
Mm,
there. But the reason that
okay.
it was good for them is that tar is waterproof and mortar
Right.
isn't.
Yeah.
You got to imagine they're trying
Which
to
also
protect against
relates to the
flood.
flood.
They're trying to protect
Yeah.
against the flood, and now they've found,
Yeah.
and I think that mortar is a little more adhesive, but
Hmm.
tar has about the same strength, but it's waterproof. So I think that's the point of tar is like, hey, we've figured out to make bricks in an assembly-like fashion that allows us to abstract to huge towers, and now we have an adhesive that's waterproof. This is going to be able to protect against any flood. So I think that's kind of like how they like rationalized
Hmm.
the construction.
I don't have a good intuition on how the technological part um, fits, or how the technological part was, you know, part of the corrupting factor that made the whole project fail, and then what it is about that in particular that God, you know, took issue with.
Well, I think it's the capacity for rational abstraction. So as soon as they realized that
Okay.
they could make bricks very fast and in an assembly-like
Hmm.
fashion, they started to abstract that idea. And abstraction is a rational function. It's saying
Yeah.
like, all right, how big could we build this tower? And that's
Hmm.
natural and a good thing for humans. It's powerful to be
Yeah.
able to rationally abstract, but we always run the risk of falling in love with our own abstractions and then becoming
Hmm.
total. So it's like it seems to be something that's increasing the capacity for human consciousness, but also increasing our capacity for inflation,
Yeah.
um,
I guess
especially in the face of flood.
my question is like, how are people supposed to know, like, when you're given this impulse to act, which is given to you by God as part of your nature, how do you know what voices to listen to and what voices to reject? You know,
Mm.
because even if you go back in the Old Testament and you look at the prophets, I mean, it's madness. It's like, who in their right mind? And then you're also just you're trusting the voice of a human rather than your own internal voice, which seems to be what the problem is with Babel in the first place, is
Mm.
like not really understanding or putting the right value constraints on information that comes from an unknown place, and
Mm.
then valuing it correctly, so you know that, okay, this is the good information, the stable information that is going to benefit me over time, that I can sacrifice the present moment for to invest in the future moment, because the future moment's going to be stable and allow me to flourish, rather
Yeah.
than, you know, do something that's going to end up, like, biting me in the ass in a couple of years. So, I mean, I think that that's really one of the fundamental issues with just being alive on earth and being a spiritual person, because you
Mm.
have these like impulses and you have these visions, right? Because
Mm.
we have these like voices and images that are going on in our head all the time. And then how do you discern what those visions are, especially if you are thinking that God is speaking to you and you must align your entire life with that vision, and then you have to align your family, your community, perhaps your whole nation. And if you do it correctly, you have Christ. And
Yeah.
if you do it incorrectly, you have, like, you know, Hitler,
Yeah.
and it's like, where are the tools of discernment to know that?
Yeah.
So it's just,
If you look
it's,
at Noah, like
yeah,
Noah had a vision
yeah,
that was deeply meaningful to him for building an ark. Nimrod
mm-hmm,
had a vision of building a tower. Like where did Nimrod's vision come from, and how was he to
mm-hmm.
know that it was going to fall apart? Um,
Also, there's an ark in Kansas.
yeah, yeah,
The
yeah,
that what the fuck's that guy doing?
yeah,
You know what I mean? And I so I mean, that's for me, when I look at my life in general, the fundamental issue is, having all these impulses, intuitions, and hearing, I guess voices, nonverbal voices, intuitions from the
mm,
beyond, knowing where to invest my energy so that
mm,
and then so many times when you do invest your energy in a certain project, it seems like it's destined to fail. But in that failure, you're still brought a couple steps forward. So it's like two steps forward, one step back. And so
Yeah,
oftentimes you are brought, part of the progression is nonlinear, and you are brought, you're brought into these situations where you are destined to fail. But the
yeah,
failure is a small failure in the service of a bigger success. So you like lose the battle but win the war, perhaps. But I don't know.
yeah,
But that perspective is, I mean, for what end? So that you get on your deathbed and then you're like, oh, okay, actually, I did a really good job and I can die without guilt. Or are we going into the next realm, which seems to be what the Old Testament was all about, especially pre-Old Testament with the Egyptians and whatnot, where you're like you're preparing your home in heaven, which is also what Christ talks about.
mm,
So
yeah. And I kind of think that
yeah,
God
it's challenging.
God gave Nimrod the vision to build the Tower of Babel
Hmm.
in a way. But maybe he didn't know that it would fail, or he needed him to do it knowing it would fail anyway because it was going to increase consciousness. Because I keep thinking about all the people who, at the end of the Babel story, everyone's scattered across the earth.
Hmm.
You don't think all those people started building towers, just smaller versions? Like
Right.
realizing the inflation of the Tower of Babel and inspired by that idea, but realizing, hey, let's not build it to heaven this time. Let's just build it 10 stories, you know? So I
But then
wonder how much
that's
how much
yeah.
the attempt to build the Tower of Babel, even though it was a failure, could have been a
Hmm.
huge inspiration for the development of civilization and building skyscrapers in the future. But it seems like that first attempt, when you've got that vision of a new technology, you inevitably end up inflating it way too high and it ends up
Hmm.
crashing down.
So if you had to take anything away from this discussion and reading Babel, like what can you grab onto about it that's solid that you would use in your life, like moving forward?
Well, it's a recognition that any new revolutionary technology that I use
Hmm.
will increase my capacity for abstraction, and that the risk of that is psychological inflation and me adopting
Hmm.
an ideology an ideological system that tries to encompass everything under one language. And I know that's kind of a long a long thing to say, but that's what
Yeah.
I'm taking from it. Like outside of the moral of like follow the command of God to spread the earth and confront the unknown. That's like one moral.
Hmm.
Um, Another is like just don't like trying to control a system under one language is futile because we're limited beings in an infinite world, and the capacity for the logos will inevitably bubble up and point out holes in that language system.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Before we started recording, and I was talking to you about what 2024 is going to look like and the expansion of my own creative impulses and how that's going to land in the world. I'm really noticing that inside of myself where so much of my life has been, even though I have this really kind of wide open perspective of like what art, what my work can be, it's pretty narrow. And I think that a lot of my career has been focused on what has worked rather than just
Mm,
radically going and doing different things. Like, like I was painting exclusively in black and white, like that image behind your
mm,
head for like 15 years before I even started doing color,
mm.
right? And then God knows, like I draw a bird or a fish or, that
Yeah,
just seems like that's not ever happening. But now I
yeah,
look at it and I'm like, well, maybe it's time I should actually like draw
yeah.
something
Because there's a
specific
Babel
rather than
story in
just
there.
patterns.
And the Babel story
Hmm.
there is that you're staying in known
I
territory.
know.
That's exactly
Is
what
it
they did.
coming? Is the Tower of
Yeah,
Babel about to crumble on my head? Yeah,
yeah,
maybe it is. Maybe it is.
yeah. Because I also think even though it's a story about like social groups, it's a story about
Yeah.
individuals as well. And that's
Hmm.
why I like that because in the Bible it doesn't mention who led the development of the Tower of Babel, but in the Talmud it mentions that it's Nimrod, and there's a few other
Hmm.
commentaries that mention Nimrod. And Nimrod was like a descendant of Noah, and he was a great warrior, the first king, the first guy to
Hmm.
establish. And
Hmm.
after he did that, and this is from the Flavius Josephus commentary, but he
Hmm.
says that they basically started seeing like all of these benefits. They started like having lots of kids, they had lots of food, they were all really healthy. And Nimrod, he thought that it was because of him instead of because of
Yeah.
God. And he resented
Mm.
God. He wanted to get revenge against God because God had destroyed nearly all of their forefathers. And can you imagine that? Like, there's only like a handful of
Yeah.
people left on Earth after God came and destroyed everyone, and then you're meant to follow that God. So Nimrod
Well, it's
basically,
kind of like the Captain Ahab and Moby Dick, right? So
yeah, I'm
there's this
reading Moby
like
Dick right now, actually.
oh, are you? Yeah, so the white whale is kind of like the Leviathan,
Yeah, exactly.
and then Ahab's kind of like an aggro Job. You know what I mean? Where he's like, "Oh, you think you can fuck with me? You think you can?" And then he just
Yeah,
goes on this the global journey to just avenge his ego being smited.
yeah,
It's kind of amazing though, because and then Terrence McKenna has an interesting comment about that story because he says that it's really a story about fair play. He's like,
Hmm.
if God can do this to man, then man has the opportunity to touch God in a way,
yeah,
because
yeah.
so it's interesting. It's a paradox, but
Yeah, that's why we
it's
typically see Ahab as a negative character because he's psychologically
yeah,
inflated, he's megalomaniacal, he's obsessed. But he was also trying to catch the Leviathan. And that's why
yeah.
Carl Jung thought that Moby Dick was the greatest American novel and that Ahab was a kind of a fucked up hero
Yeah,
because
and it's kind of refers to like Jonah too, right? So rather than getting swallowed
yeah,
by the whale and being on the inside of an overwhelming state of
he was trying to
consciousness,
swallow the
you're
whale.
yeah, it's like inverting it. You're saying like you're not going to do this to me. I do this to you,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is kind of what Christ is doing too in a way where it's like, but it's in a different way where he's in a bit of a hostile relationship with the Jews, throwing over the money changing. Then he's in like a state of equality with the Romans, give unto Caesar what is Caesar, give unto God what is God. But in both of those things, he's on the advance, like he's advancing into the the unknown, like whatever it is that reality is presenting himself with, like even the crucifixion. Even though he
yeah,
has that moment in the Garden of Gethsemane where he asks God to take this cup from him, like he goes in and the crucifixion doesn't happen to him, he happens to the crucifixion.
yeah. Because if
Like,
you
because
think
he
about
could
it,
have just ran, he could have just left.
yeah, and if
It's kind of
Christ
like
is,
Socrates, too, what he did.
yeah, exactly. And if Christ is God himself, then the death
Mm-hmm.
and resurrection is really the death and resurrection of God. And that's why, like, we never
Oh,
talk
yeah, that
about
is true.
we never talk about God changing, and all the ancient Egyptian myths are the death and
Mm-hmm.
resurrection of God, the death and resurrection of Osiris.
Yeah.
So yes,
Well,
it
and the
was.
scattering of all the body parts and having to, um,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
what,
They cut up all his body parts, spread them out, and
yeah,
then Isis had to go find them and
yeah,
put them
that's
back
right.
together. And then she got impregnated by him, by all his body parts, and that's what
Mm-hmm.
created Horus, the hero who ended up avenging Osiris or avenging Seth. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so there's like an echo of that idea of a dying and resurrecting God um, in Christianity through Christ.
Yeah.
It expresses an idea that God changes over time and that we have the capacity to somehow influence that change. And I think Jung had the same view. Um, and it's in the story of Job as well. Like his wrestling with God changes God. So Jung thinks that the story of Christ, that actually the story of Job is a precursor to the story of Christ. That
Mm-hmm.
unless Job
Definitely.
had wrestled with God, then
Mm-hmm.
God wouldn't have been able to come down in man as Christ. So
So
it seems like
maybe,
we wrestle with him and change him as he changes us in some way, which is a an inflated idea to even think about. But
well, or not. I mean, we don't know. We don't know what fucking consciousness is. We have no idea. And so then when you think about like AI and all this, like, it's wild. But maybe the story with Babel is there's just an inevitability of,
Yes.
there's
Yeah.
just an inevitability of like human beings are just what they are. And you just go in and you advance towards your fate. You accept it, amor fati, and you just live it out in the same way. So there's in a way it's analogous to, Christ embracing the crucifixion, perhaps, um, you know, everyone involved in the story of, the Tower of Babel is advancing towards their fate and accepting their, the inevitability of the encounter with God. And,
Yeah. Yep.
and if we're eternal beings, then maybe, that's not the end. Maybe it is like a 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And Babel
Yeah.
is a 1 step back, but it still advances the project of the human being adapting to its environment. It still, it advances that part of it in the same way that we're talking about it now.
Yeah,
You
like
know,
I think it caused an increase in consciousness, and
yeah.
it caused a shift of human language from being homogeneous to being heterogeneous,
Hmm.
which is incredible. That's like a miracle. And it humbles us as well. It shows us
Hmm.
like we've got so much power with our language and the ability to abstract that we can create language systems that can try and encompass everything. But it's a humbling story, and it's saying like any attempt by you to try and boil down the transcendent in one language is going to fail. And if you try and
Hmm.
bring other people into that system, they're going to start speaking another language naturally, and whatever system you've got is going to fall apart. You see humanity constantly playing out the Tower of Babel story over and over again.
Hmm.
I see it with all the big tech companies, like particularly the monopolies. They've built
Hmm.
a Tower of Babel essentially. And we're seeing this push towards globalism and technocracy, and it just seems so aligned with this story. I feel like
Hmm.
our culture is acting out the Babel myth again right now. And that's why I
My
keep thinking in my head.
my takeaway from this conversation is just build the fucking tower. Just build it. Just go, do it. Build it. See what happens. I think that I've never thought that before, but maybe just try to be wiser about it, about how you build it. But
Hmm.
it does seem to me that God gave man this impulse, and
Yes.
and in a way it's God calling man into him. And the way that man in this example is doing that is trying to build a ladder, like Jacob's ladder, or, a tower to heaven, which is what we're all trying to do in our life. It's what I'm trying to
Yeah.
do with my artwork. It's what I'm trying to do in relationship. It's what I'm trying to do
And
all
it's
the
rational.
time.
It's rational in the face of a
Hmm.
catastrophic flood. It's
Yeah.
rational to try and build a tower to heaven, especially if you've got waterproof tar. You've got these easy assembly block bricks
Hmm.
like that. I can just imagine. I keep imagining the builders and the construction and their interactions.
Hmm.
And I
Yeah.
just imagine that first moment when someone had a revelation building that brick and just saw the tower in his head. But that abstraction, he couldn't control it because he had nothing for it to fit within, no category system. So
Hmm.
it ended up just inflating itself all the way to heaven. And I think it's very similar with psychedelic experiences where
Yeah.
you have this huge vision of heaven, but then it's very hard to actually integrate that into your life.
Hmm.
But I
And
think,
then it
like you
makes,
said, it's inevitable. Like it's inevitable
yeah.
that we're going to have new
Yeah.
technologies, more capacity for reason and abstraction, psychological inflation, and then some sort of crash, and it's spreading out.
Yeah.
And
You
that just
just keep
happens over
going.
and over
You just
again.
keep going.
Yeah.
And then why is it that the pyramids fucking made it and the Tower of Babel didn't? And the pyramids seem to be even more of a egregious, uh,
Oh,
an
well,
egregious
I think,
violation
yeah,
of hubris in the face of God. And
I've
that's
been
like,
thinking about that though. But they didn't
eh.
try and build it all the way to heaven. It was limited.
They didn't.
And, well, I don't think that they did.
I mean, we don't know
I
ultimately,
think they
but.
were trying to represent the idea of a pure hierarchy on Earth that didn't
Hmm.
necessarily try and reach heaven, but got damn close. But if you look at all the artistic representations of the Tower of Babel, they're
Yeah, it's
circular
all
spiral
janky and yeah,
structures that go
it's
like all
like
the way to heaven. So I think
yeah.
it's like a different
Hmm.
thought of construction. I actually think that the pyramids were like a better way of
Well,
building a similar
the
idea.
the construction is better. It's more of an environmental fit. It has more environmental fitness. So maybe
Hmm.
the issue with Babel is not even the impulse or why did you do it or the hubris or all of that. Maybe it's just as simple as it's just bad technology. You just need better technology.
No, I don't know because it seemed like good
It's that
technology.
fucking tar,
Like
dude. No,
we
it's the
still,
tar. The tar fucked them up.
yeah,
There's no tar in the pyramids.
yeah, true. There's no mortar either at all.
No,
Is there?
it's just gravity. It's just
That's
gravity.
insane.
I know. I know.
I
It's
think
like
that's
I. What
sorry,
was
go
that?
ahead. I was just
Oh,
gonna
I
say
was
that
just gonna.
just a wrap.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, we should. No, I really like that. Yeah, I did not think that we would end here. That was an interesting journey to a point, which for me, where it ends is like it's you just go, you just say yes. So the Tower
Yeah.
of Babel was saying yes, and that's the lesson. You say yes and just try to mitigate the consequences and try to have better technology and try to be smarter about it. But you
So
go
your
forth.
takeaway is, despite the fact that Babel was a failure, they
Yeah.
still should have done it because they were following
Yeah.
their impulse.
Look at the consequence on history. Look at what it is that we have to show for it. I mean, what
Yeah.
it is Babel lives eternally now. I mean, we're
Yeah.
talking about it today. And so
Exactly.
it
Yeah.
you know, in the realm of pure consciousness, in the realm of heaven, it's a success.
Yeah. So we're redeeming Nimrod by
Yeah.
retelling his story in a positive light.
Yeah. Great job, Nimrod. You did
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, great
Yeah.
conversation, mate. And I like
Yeah,
this
yeah, I
idea of
enjoyed it.
like discussing a tiny little story from the Bible because it's
Yeah, it's
crazy that
cool.
a story that takes 30 seconds to tell we can talk about for an hour. It's pretty wild.
Well, and then we ended up in a completely different place than where
Yeah.
I thought it was. I mean, I thought about this quite a bit and I had no idea it was going to end up here. So it's going, and it's
Yeah.
actually something that I can apply to my life too,
Hmm.
because I feel like going boldly into the unknown, even if it fails, is still, you know, it's something that I haven't developed as much. And so going into this next year, I feel that it's valuable. So I really appreciate the conversation. Yeah, it was fun. That was a good one.
Yeah. You too, mate.
All right, man. I love you. I'll talk to
Yep.
you later. All
Love you
right.
too, mate.
All right. Later.